Welcome to another of our contested collections series, in which we delve into the museum's ethnology collections for a closer look at some of the hidden histories and untold stories that these objects can tell us. Today we're going to have a look at some of the museum's collections relating to the heritage of the indigenous people of the southeastern USA. The items that we'll use to start our discussions are a ferrotype photograph and a leather Blackfoot tunic. The interesting aspect about both of these objects is that upon closer observation and interrogation by specialists visiting the museum, they've been re-identified. The first object that we will look at is a ferrotype depicting three so-called Native American chiefs from the Ottawa River area of Canada, wearing what appear to be Native American costume. The photograph was donated by Reverend Philip Carpenter in 1865. As well as being a Methodist minister, Carpenter was also involved in the anti-slavery movement. Between the years 1846 and 1858, Carpenter travelled the southern states of America to see the condition of slaves for himself, and in 1859 he defied the threat of being tarred and feathered to deliver a lecture against slavery. It is likely that this photograph was collected whilst on his travels in America. In 1999, a Native American visitor to the museum was both surprised and intrigued by this photograph and believed that it was an unusual example of a studio photograph of what appears to be the Cherokee people. The Cherokee are North American Indians, part of one of the largest politically integrated tribes at the time of European colonization of the Americas. He also commented that the clothes are certainly not Native American, so who are the people shown in this photograph, and where was it taken? One clue to the history of the photograph is the kind of photography that was used, and this is an early form of photograph known as ferrotype or tintype. Unlike photographs on card or paper, ferrotypes do not need to dry, and so ferrotype photographers often worked outside at fairs and carnivals. If this photograph of a group of Native Americans was taken at a fair or a carnival, the Native Americans pictured may have been performers. This would explain why they are not wearing traditional Native American costume. This Blackfoot tunic dates to around 1900, and we've been informed by an academic from the University of Frankfurt that the wavy prolongation to the sleeves and the design and colours of the beaded strips and collar both indicate that the clothing is from the Blackfoot people. The tunic was donated to the museum by a British collector and dealer of ethnographic art and European arms and armour during the late 19th and early 20th century. He had a business called W.O. Oldman Ethnographical Specimens based in London, which was most active between the late 1890s and 1913. Oldman purchased collections from various sources, including items that were considered surplus from many small British museums. In addition to holding auctions, he also reserved items for possible sale to private collectors and scholars. He maintained frequent correspondence with his network of collectors, and he was often visited by museum professionals and scholars from institutions around the world. Ethnographic specimens with a provenance to Oldman's business can be found in various public institutions around the world, including the National Museum of the American Indian, Pitt Rivers Museum, the British Museum and others. Items were either collected directly from Oldman or were part of donations from other significant collectors. The Blackfoot Confederacy, sometimes referred to as the Blackfoot Nation, is comprised of three indigenous nations, the Kainai, Pilkani and Siksika. People of the Blackfoot Nation refer to themselves as the real people. The Confederacy's traditional territory spans parts of southern Alberta, Saskatchewan, as well as northern Montana. In a census taken in 2016, there were 22,490 people identified as having Blackfoot ancestry. In the era before European settlement of the prairies, the Blackfoot were bison hunters and warriors. Traditional Blackfoot culture is based on the bison hunt. They lived freely on the land, following bison across the plains to hunting grounds, where they would utilise bison jumps and runs. Blackfoot people lived in camps, sheltering in teepees. They also hunted large game such as deer and supplemented their diet with nuts, fruits and vegetables, but the bison remained the most important element of their economy, diet and way of life. The Blackfoot were also known for being fierce warriors. Despite significant population loss because of warfare, the Blackfoot Confederacy remained one of the most powerful indigenous groups on the northern plains, temporarily impeding the westward expansion of European settlers. During the summer, groups would converge to hunt bison and celebrate with elaborate feasts and dances. The sun dance, a communal celebration held annually in midsummer, was a central aspect of Blackfoot cultural life. European settlers, missionaries, opposed the Blackfoot's complex and well-established traditions. Blackfoot oral histories pass cultural traditions on to future generations. Born in Bristol on the 4th of November 1819, Philip Pearsall Carpenter was educated at Trinity Bristol College and then Manchester College at York. He gained a BA degree from the University of London in 1841, the same year in which he was ordained as a minister. In 1860 he received a first degree of Doctor of Philosophy granted by the Regents of the State of New York. So why was Philip Pearsall Carpenter so important? He is well known in the natural history world for his knowledge of shells, and he became the honorary curator of mollusks at Warrington Museum in 1848, making many improvements to the museum's collections through donations of shells, fossils, minerals and ethnographic items. He is said to have enjoyed his work at Warrington Museum, writing to his sister Mary on the 20th of April 1863. I get to Warrington at 9 punctually, dart at once to the museum, lock myself in den and bury myself in Accitonellas and all other snails and shells, till 6:15, a long and rather wearying spell, stooping over tables, holding my breath often for 9 hours and a quarter, only eating in the middle, and that often over shells. I consume 4 eggs per day and other nourishing foods in proportion. If I could afford it, I would have a photo taken of my workshop before I break it up, so splendidly is it arranged and crammed with things. I think a man deserves to be a PhD for concocting it. I shall never have such a one again. There is nothing equal to it at the British Museum or Smithsonian. Well, at 6:15 I get hungry and tired, leave everything as it is, lock up as the train comes in sight and trot down. Carpenter originally trained to be an optician, but left this career to become a Presbyterian minister. He was a vegetarian and interested in healthy living and opposed to smoking and drinking. He campaigned to improve the standard of public health in Warrington and commented on the unsanitary conditions in the town in 1847, which was suffering from the effects of the potato famine and trade depression. He remarked that he had never lived in so drunken or unhealthy a place, and that in autumn the swampy fields and market gardens smelt horribly from the potato disease. Even by the 1850s there was a strong opposition to slavery from some quarters in Warrington, resulting in the formation of the Warrington Anti-Slavery Society. Mrs. Gaskell and Carpenter's eldest sister Susan were amongst Warrington women involved in supporting the anti-slavery cause. They regularly sent contributions to the annual anti-slavery fair or bazaar in Boston, USA. In 1855, Carpenter purchased the Reagan-Mazatlan Gulf of California shell collection, one of the greatest shell collections in Europe. It comprised about 14 tons of shells in total. He donated over 8,000 specimens to the British Museum in 1857, but kept many others himself. In 1865, he emigrated to Canada, where he opened a school for boys and continued with his shell work. His field work as a malcologist or conchologist in North America is still well regarded today. A man of many talents, he wrote, published, taught, and was a volunteer explaining the growing study of shells in North America. He also turned his attention to Montreal's sanitation problems and founded the Montreal Sanitation Association in order to educate people about public health issues. Shells continued to be Carpenter's main interest, and he donated his collection to McGill College, Montreal, asking that it be kept as a special collection and that he would be honorary curator during his lifetime. Philip Pearsall Carpenter died in 1877 in Montreal, Canada, aged 57 years after suffering from typhoid fever. Carpenter toured America between 1859 and 1860 and was asked by the Smithsonian Institution to help sort and catalogue their shell collection. The Smithsonian's annual report from 1860 states, we have employed a distinguished conchologist, Mr. P. Carpenter of Warrington, England, to classify and label the extensive collection of shells, and have been favoured in this work with the cooperation of the principal gentlemen most distinguished in this country for their original investigations in this branch of natural history. There are around 26 species of shells represented in the collection at Warrington Museum and Art Gallery, donated by Philip Pearsall Carpenter. The majority of the shells are very, very small, and some are literally the size of a pinhead, with the largest being just over the size of a thumbnail. The smallest examples are on wool and the larger examples in small shallow trays. Most of them are English, a few Scottish, and about 5 are from Mazatlan. Most do not have an accession number. There is a small group of about 5 slightly larger and visually more impressive shells from the original Carpenter Mazatlan collection, which were donated in 1916 by a lady from Latchford. Slavery in America was not just limited to the European settlers colonising the country, it was also in existence within the indigenous Native American tribes. The tribes would capture and sell slaves to the Europeans, so there was essentially both slavery by and slavery of Native Americans. Prior to the European colonisation, the Native American tribes held war captives as slaves. Tribes such as the Westo, Yamasee, Shawnee and others actively enslaved members of other tribes as a means of making money from the European settlers. This type of trade was especially prominent around the province of Carolina during the 17th and 18th centuries. The Cherokee people, shown earlier in the ferrotype photograph, are also known to have been involved in slavery. In some cases, Native American slaves were allowed to live on the fringes of Native American society until they were slowly integrated into the tribe. So this is the use of the word slave in loose terms. Captives were treated differently amongst Native American groups. They could be enslaved for life, killed or adopted, which would usually follow a period of slavery. In 1830, a group known as the 5 Civilized Tribes, including the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole tribes, who were living in what is termed the American Deep South, were asked by the then American President George Washington to take on a cultural transformation from their traditional way of life towards a white American way of life. This was especially true for the Cherokee and Choctaw tribes. American settlers had been pressuring the federal government to remove Indians from the southeast, and many of the settlers were encroaching on Native American Indian lands. There was also a demand for more land to be made available to the settlers. Some people vehemently opposed these actions, and in 1830 the passage of the Indian Removal Act was granted by the government to extinguish any Indian title to land in the southeast. After the passage of the Indian Removal Act, approximately 60,000 members of the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw and Choctaw nations were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands, with thousands dying during the Trail of Tears, which was a mass displacement of Native Americans from their homelands in the southern United States to the Mississippi River. The first nation to be removed was the Choctaw in 1831, and their removal was a model for all future relocations. By 1837, 46,000 Indians from southeastern states had been removed from their homelands, thereby opening 25 million acres for settlement by the white population. The relocated peoples suffered from overexposure, disease and starvation while en route to their newly designated reserve. Thousands died before reaching their destinations or shortly after from disease. During the Trail of Tears, the tribes also took with them several thousand African slaves, some of which had been held by the Cherokee. The Cherokee are one of the indigenous peoples of the southeastern woodlands of the United States. Prior to the 18th century, they were concentrated in their homelands, in towns along river valleys of what is now southwestern North Carolina, southeastern Tennessee, edges of western South Carolina, northern Georgia, and northeastern Alabama. The Cherokee was the tribe that held the most people in slavery. In 1809, they held nearly 600 enslaved Africans. This number increased to almost 1,600 in 1835 and to around 4,000 by 1860. It was primarily the major planters that owned the largest number of slaves, such as John Vann, one of the Cherokee who held people in slavery. 83% held fewer than 10 people in slavery. Here we see a postcard written by Philip Pearsall Carpenter to William Lloyd Garrison, who was a renowned 19th century abolitionist and reformer. He delivered many addresses denouncing slavery, and he was one of the first American abolitionists to demand the immediate and complete emancipation of all slaves. We also see a handwritten letter from Carpenter to Garrison, in which Carpenter refers to items that he has enclosed for an anti-slavery fair. This appears to have been a fundraising fair, presumably to raise money for the anti-slavery movement. Fighting for the anti-slavery movement was very much a family affair for the Carpenters, with Philip's brother Russell and sister Mary also being involved in this cause. The anti-slavery movement developed early on in Warrington, and despite the town's proximity to Manchester, it forged its own connections with anti-slavery activists in America who made the town a major stop in terms of delivering their anti-slavery message. We know that Moses Roper, who was born in North Carolina, the son of a white farmer named Henry Roper and a slave, visited Warrington and met with Thomas Glazebrook Rylands. Roper escaped captivity in 1834, and the following year he fled to England, where slavery had been abolished 2 years earlier. We also know that Frederick Douglass also stayed at Thomas's house in Warrington during his tour of England in 1846. In England, Moses Roper met with key abolitionists who helped him to gain admission to various schools and universities, so that Roper could then write the story of his life as a slave in his own words. The resulting autobiographical tale, entitled A Narrative of the Adventures and Escape of Moses Roper from American Slavery, was one of the earliest accounts of slavery in America to reach Britain, and shocked English society with its reports of torture and humiliation. For several years Moses toured the country, spreading the word of the horrors of American slavery, and we know he visited Warrington in 1838 because in the archive collection we have a copy of his narrative dedicated by the author to local philanthropist Thomas Glazebrook Rylands in his home in Beauty House, dated March 30, 1838. Born into slavery in Maryland, Frederick Douglass escaped in 1838 and fled to Massachusetts, where in 1845 he published his work, A Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. This recounts the harsh and often brutal life Frederick suffered as a slave, his early glimpses of education and his escape to freedom. Frederick credited much of his early political thinking to having read Dialogue Between a Master and a Slave by Warrington authors Letitia Barbauld and her brother John Aitken. Frederick had read this Warrington pamphlet on the rights of slaves to fight for their independence, and furthermore he had read this whilst he was still a slave, when reading or writing was forbidden, and the punishment for doing either was severe. Shortly after publication, Frederick travelled to Ireland in 1845, and from there to England in 1846, where he lectured on the abolitionist cause at the Mechanics' Institute in Warrington twice within the space of a year. Following the American Civil War, Douglass became a prominent figure in American politics and fought for the rights of many minority groups, but particularly for those of African Americans and women. Sarah Parker Raymond was born in Massachusetts and became known as an international activist for human rights and women's suffrage. She delivered her first speech against slavery at the age of 16 and went on to deliver speeches against slavery throughout the northeast United States. It was during one of these tours in 1858 that she encountered the Warrington postmaster and anti-slavery campaigner William Robson in Boston. William Robson was instrumental in persuading Raymond to travel to England via Warrington to gather support for the abolitionist cause in the United States. Her ship arrived in Liverpool on January 12, 1859. It had not been an easy journey. The ship had been covered with ice and snow, and Raymond had become so seasick that she had to regain her strength with a few days of recuperation in William Robson's home in Warrington. Many sources state that Sarah Raymond's first lecture in Britain was actually given in Warrington, but her first British lecture on the 21st of January 1859 was given at the Tuckham Institute in Liverpool. The Warrington lectures were, however, intended to be the inaugural speeches of the tour, and the first one was held on the 24th of January 1859 at Warrington Music Hall. Reman's first Warrington speech was free to enter, and it was so well attended there was standing room only. Several notable people were unable to get in. The meeting was presided over by Robert Gaskell, Secretary of the Warrington Anti-Slavery Society. Contemporary accounts describe the meeting as the best attended public event in the town's history, with an audience composed mostly of working people. After the success of the first meeting, a second one was arranged, again at the Warrington Music Hall, for the 31st of January 1859. There was a small charge for this meeting, which solved the overcrowding of the first one. One contemporary account notes that during this lecture, a Mr. William North, an ex-slave from South Carolina, now living in nearby Earlstown, was also on the platform with Reverend, though he does not seem to have spoken. In addition to raising a donation of $100 for the American Anti-Slavery Society, Reman's Warrington lectures rekindled local anti-slavery sentiment and encouraged a record number of 3,522 local residents, including politicians and clergy, to sign a petition against American slavery. William Robson himself wrote, "I may add that no address on any subject has ever been more numerously signed in this town." The outbreak of the American Civil War a few years later did not affect Warrington as dramatic as Manchester, but the message was the same for the workers of Warrington, one of solidarity with those enslaved and the campaign to abolish slavery. Abolitionism in Warrington was now deeply embedded in local politics. That's the end of today's session. Next month we'll be looking at the Crosfields soap manufacturing industry and their involvement with the trade in palm oil. The items in the museum collections which we will be focusing upon are jewellery and tools which were brought over from West Africa within a cargo being shipped by Mrs. Joseph Crosfields for use in their soap manufacturing business. We hope that you can join us then.